Hey, it's Addo. So if everything goes according to plan and I'm publishing this video on the right day, provided I finish on time, today is my 20th birthday. I've always been fascinated with the idea of turning 20 because for me, as a kid I always saw it as this distant, intangible concept that I never really thought I would actually reach. While I was ruminating on that recently, I thought about how the first generation of people who were on the internet before puberty is now in their early 20s, and how for the first time we're gaining access to a bunch of anecdotal experience about how using the internet as a way of life as a child affects your development into a young adult. In my specific case, this game right here has unexpectedly been a huge part of my life. I started playing it when I was 13, and what I've gotten out of it is something I'll probably carry with me for as long as I live. I have always attributed my GD-related personal growth to my engagement with the community across platforms like Discord, and Twitch, and Twitter, and Skype, and even the niche ones like Amino and the unfortunately discontinued Google+. But the fascinating part is that with this game and community being centered around creating art, the levels that you build over time can sort of visually reflect your journey of personal growth. And that's something that I wanted to cover today. So why exactly am I interested in this, and who am I to have anything to say about it? In the event that anyone who watches this may be a parent concerned about whether getting into the game or socializing on the internet in general will be beneficial or dangerous for their child, I want to briefly explain some context about where I'm coming from with this, and why I'm making a video about it. So these days I'm a full-time undergraduate student pursuing a bachelor's degree in psychological science with the intent of going to graduate school to be licensed in mental health counseling and hopefully get some experience in diagnosing and treating developmental disabilities. And on the side, I dabble in music a lot as sort of a DIY songwriter, vocalist, composer, and producer. These are both passions that I can credit the GD community for having helped me discover. Throughout my time in the community, I've been volunteering service to the developer as a moderator since May 21st of 2017. I was an administrator for the official Discord server for the game for 3 years. I've had a hand in overseeing some other public and private sub-community groups more focused on the art and practice of creating levels, and as a creator myself, 56 out of my 100 currently published levels have been featured by the developer. While all of that makes me generalizable to an extremely small fraction of the total community population, for a bulk of that journey I was just a kid on the internet, which is why I wanted to share this with you, and because of all the levels I've created while living through that journey, I have a unique opportunity to back that up with visual illustrations. I wish to stress that I was not paid to make this video in any way, shape, or form, and these are all my own candid observations and opinions. It was around 7 years ago when I finally caved in and used a Google Play gift card to buy the full version of the game on my $30 7-inch Android tablet. I was 13 and found the free trial version really enticing. It's the kind of innocent awe that a lot of mobile game companies take advantage of for profit. But this game chose instead to deliver what may very well be the most bang for my buck I've ever had. Since this doesn't cover a full year, it was a pretty short era for me. I only published about 5 levels or so. I built really fast because I had no concept of standards. By no concept of standards, I mean I have some unpublished levels that were actually so bad that the autofilter bot mistakenly assumed that they were spam and deleted them. I jumped straight into creating before even looking at what other people had made because it didn't really concern me all that much. I was intrinsically motivated to carry out my own visions and have fun, and because of that, I was happy. In terms of how we grow and develop, I think that this is a great place to start. I was in a stable position because I was oblivious to the standards that I wasn't meeting. I had no contact with anyone in the community, nor did I know such a thing even existed. I was merely dropping myself into a toolbox and allowing myself to explore what it had to offer without constraining myself to any obligations that would have held me up for any longer than absolutely necessary to do what I wanted and move on. There's no regard for structure. Here are some saws and some spikes that are literally just floating in midair. I had no regard for whether or not my colors actually agreed with one another. The levels hardly resemble or take any inspiration from the classic levels native to the game, all because I had no assessment of what was better or worse, quote unquote. The funny thing is that there are some sort of interesting ideas in these, if you're looking for them, but their execution is the path of least resistance, and at the time I was happy with that. Partaking in my family's religious traditions, I gave up the game for Lent, which is a 40-day period before Easter where you give up something you enjoy. So since that's right before Easter and my birthday is in February, I would have turned 14 right before Lent started. Despite that, a third of all the levels that I've uploaded to my account were uploaded when I was 14. To cope with not getting to play the game, I would watch videos of other people playing it, and it was here where I was introduced to where the golden standards were. The most substantial thing that I had to miss out on was the release of Cataclysm, at the time the hardest known level in the game, and one of the most influential levels ever made. That became my fixation, and so when Easter finally rolled around, I started building this. It's the first time I'd ever been directly influenced by someone else's work. And even though it's still blatantly amateur, what's scary is that it's a noticeable improvement in terms of execution. It has a color palette, it has some rhyme and reason to its structure. When my own ideas start to seep in is when it starts to look worse again. I continued developing on this sort of style, gradually picking up on more influences, and the strange thing is, I hadn't actually noticed the difference in quality until other people pointed it out. I had started to post in forums and chat on the fan wiki and get into the community in other ways, and I was excited to share my work because of the fickle pressure of wanting to watch these numbers go up, so I would share all of them, because I was equally proud of all of them. Surprisingly, the feedback that I got wasn't rude. It was really civil, but it was definitely not sugar-coated at all, and the general consensus was, yeah, these newer ones are taking a step in the right direction and all, but these older ones are garbage and you should cut your losses with them. I was reinforced for taking inspiration from other levels, and discouraged from going about taking things my own way. It's Thorndike's law of effect. Behaviors that yield positive outcomes are more likely to be repeated. As a result, this is where my motivation to build shifted from something internal to something external. In the same way that conformity works in high school, fitting into the convention was reinforced, and disregarding it was seen as inferior and amateur. At this time, there was a very brutal divide between the higher-up creators and the rest of the community. There was basically no trace of them online because they only talked in tightly knit private circles. Their ability to send and suggest levels to the developer to be featured wasn't even publicly known or acknowledged at the time, and they used it amongst themselves to reward the same tiny handful of friends almost exclusively. It was an extremely rare occasion for new people to be acknowledged. A friend that I had made on the wiki chat room announced that he was leaving the wiki because he'd been sort of recruited and pulled in by these people, like some sort of induction, and that since he had connections now, he needed to reorganize his priorities. I reached out to see if we could still keep in touch, and he responded, "I don't have time for people like you anymore." Having essentially been traded in for creator points, I made it a mission to pursue the same rewards that he would be getting, because I was a dramatic teenager, and I wanted him to regret trading in his friends for something he could have gotten without cutting ties with them. At this point, my motivation was no longer internal. That's not passion for creative vision anymore. It's spite. I relied on external reinforcement as a metric of success, and was willing to conform as much as I had to in order to get it. I didn't abandon my ideas, but I tried to express them in ways that agreed with what had already been seen before. I started entering contests and following their rules. I started collaborating and adapting to other people's styles. I mimicked styles that I observed people praising. I started giving people what they wanted, even if it wasn't what I wanted. And it worked. My level 4 shadow was the first one of them to get featured by the developer, followed by 5 others in that week alone. Scarily enough, that was really all it took to light the spark. If you keep looking at that from the behaviorist perspective, it sends a very clear message. Keep repeating this behavior, and that will yield you more revenge. So I did. But it stopped working. The reinforcement wasn't continuous. I would drop 6 levels and nothing would happen, and then the next one, the developer throws me a bone. They're all sort of built around the same premise, too. How can I execute this idea in the most familiar way with the least exertion? It was expression with an anchor of a constant need for approval. I turned 15 before it finally started working again. I started resolving my cognitive dissonance by claiming that there's some kind of intention behind it, like proving that decoration is important by making a fun but extremely ugly level that I could finish more quickly than if I tried to make it good. I started developing specific conventions in how I designed that I would reuse to speed up the thinking process of how to decorate, like a mental heuristic. It wasn't a means of expression anymore, it was a formula that I tweaked over that year to yield the right answer every time. But I didn't question whose definition of right and wrong I was accepting as the baseline. It was through this that I inadvertently started developing a skill of patience, gradually defaulting to methods that I could rely on to be reinforced, even though they took longer than what I would spend if I had only operated in my comfort zone like I did when I first started building. Standards for playability went up. We stopped forgiving stuff so easily for being broken just because it looked cool. The developer realized a need to cater more to new players by making friendlier levels more available. I started focusing more on making my levels more playable and friendly, because their unplayability and unfriendliness was preventing them from being reinforced. I started making skeletons of how levels would play, and then autopiloting to fill them in with decoration now that decoration was no longer the limiting reagent. This is precisely the point where I stopped having fun with building, as it became a numb, soulless process of assembly and production of a product to fulfill a need that was entirely externally driven and defined. This is how younger teenagers work. There's this constant drive to express and be heard, but also to be approved of and understood, and they haven't yet learned enough about themselves in order to discover how to fulfill both of these needs without sacrificing one for the other. Before I turned 16, I had a bit of a crisis. I had a need to be approved of by strangers and also understood by friends. And I ran into a situation where I stood at the crossfire between two groups that disliked each other, one out of a lack of trust, and the other out of a sort of indignation that they kept losing the friends who wanted to meet the other group. In an attempt to please both groups, what I had to do to please one group was precisely the thing that the other disliked, which led to my complete and total exile from both of them. The lesson here is knowing how to pick who to disappoint, owning your choice, and learning how to not see yourself as a monster because of it. It was much more advantageous for me to figure that out digitally in a space that wasn't dependent on my physical life, but it was really the only thing on my mind for 6 months straight. These are like simulations of real-world events, except everyone involved are real people that can hurt and can be hurt. The reason I make a big deal about that is because I had no one who I could trust to tell about in my real physical life. If you are a parent, make sure your kid knows they can work that out with you if they want. At 16, I started channeling how I felt about that conundrum into the levels I was making, from the disturbingly freeing sensation of starting over, to the frustration of not being able to tell the difference between not being forgiven and not being understood. I felt like I had something to prove. I started focusing on those ideas again. I started focusing more on using art as a means of communication. And of course, with that personal growth came a noticeable improvement in the quality of my work again. I'm not a good creator. I never made anything like artistically legendary or whatever, but it was finally me again. I stopped caring about the statistics of getting more and more features because I already had plenty and wasn't happy with any of them. My point was already proven. I didn't need to prove it any farther. There was no value to that external reinforcer anymore. No one else was happy with them either. People hated my levels, and I had to learn to be okay with that. My junior and senior year of high school, when I was 17 and 18, made up a period of radio silence for me when it came to releasing levels, for a number of reasons. For one, school got a lot harder and more demanding, and I had to come to terms with having to leave building in the background to leave room in the front for the productive stuff. Had I stumbled across making music first, which is something that I have a lot harder time putting down once it's put in front of me, I probably wouldn't have done my best work in college. This isn't to say that I didn't build at all, though. I did. But my motivation was constantly sucked away by the looming frustration that I was just not good enough. I had this assumption that now that I wasn't a stranger to the community, and now that I had shown that I could improve, people would be writing on whether or not I disappointed them with my next project in order to make their final judgments. I could never quite tell if the pressure was internal or external, but either way, it was eating me alive to feel censored by my own incompetence. When I was 19, I retaliated. I built to disappoint. I made 3 levels, and all of them were intentional violations of expectations that led me to stall on and cancel previous projects. I was live streaming once, and someone who I highly respected for their design prowess joined and said, "Wow, you really are shit at block design, aren't you?" And I never touched the level again. Even when decorating other levels, I was afraid I would just ruin them. So I started making a level with no block design. I was never satisfied with my gameplay because it was always the thing people complained about, so I started making the most unplayable, unfair, obnoxious level I have ever made. People hate 2x1 slopes. I responded with gameplay made entirely out of 2x1 slopes and nothing else. Ironically, it took the personal growth and maturity that comes with becoming an adult to stop giving people what they wanted and start being comfortable with giving them what they didn't want. What's scary is that these levels are like grandiose, more developed versions of levels that I made when I was 13. The difference is that back then, I was satisfied because I was oblivious to the standards, and now I am satisfied because I no longer need the standards to validate me. That change is what made the difference in my real life. I lived alone when I started on all 3 of these levels, and I think starting college, doing my part to not catch or spread COVID-19, and taking the initiative to make and finish and release my own music in that year were all both enablers and products of this readiness and willingness not to spite people, but to be me despite whatever it is that people wanted. Now, this isn't to discredit the community experience. If I hadn't met the people that I've met in this community, I'd probably be nowhere. That much is obvious to me. But what is much more subtle is how the process of learning how to create and use this game as an art form has left behind 100 little snapshots that tell the story of a mind that lost and found itself. So, was it worth it to grow up with this game? I'd say that while there were certainly things I regretted or wished never happened, the experience was absolutely worth it. But anyone who works with statistics like myself knows that anecdotal evidence like this means nothing by itself. So if you've also grown up playing this game, please feel free to share your story and answer the question for yourself in the comments. Thank you so much for your time, I hope I didn't waste it, and have a wonderful rest of your life.